Commander Zarakith stood on the bridge of her massive warship and looked down at the blue planet below her. The third planet from this small yellow star looked so peaceful and quiet from space. She had conquered 17 worlds before this one, and each time it had been the same story. The natives would see her ships and either surrender immediately or fight a brief, hopeless battle before giving up. This planet called Earth looked no different from all the others. Her sensors showed primitive technology and a population that had not even mastered space travel properly. They still used chemical rockets to barely escape their own atmosphere. It would be another easy victory for the Vorthok, and Pura Zarakith was tall, even by Vorthok standards. Standing nearly 8 feet in her armor, her skin had a blue-gray color, and her eyes were large and silver. She had 4 arms, which made her excellent at controlling multiple weapon systems at once. Her people were born warriors, and she had never lost a battle in her 20 years of service. The ship's computer spoke in the harsh Vorthok language, reporting that all systems were ready for atmospheric entry. Her crew of 50 warriors waited for her command to begin the invasion. Each one was trained from birth to fight and conquer. They had never known defeat, and did not expect to start now. But as her ship entered Earth's atmosphere, something went wrong. The planet's star suddenly released a massive burst of energy that her sensors had not detected. Solar radiation flooded through space and interfered with her ship's systems. The navigation computer began giving wrong readings. The engine controls stopped responding properly. Zarakith tried to regain control, but it was too late. Her massive dreadnought was falling toward the surface like a metal meteor. She managed to activate the emergency landing systems just before impact. The ship crashed into a field with tremendous force, digging a deep crater and throwing dirt and debris everywhere. When Zarakith regained consciousness, she was lying in the wreckage of her bridge. Her head hurt badly, and green blood trickled down her face. Her communication systems were destroyed, and half her crew was unconscious. The ship's hull had cracked in several places, and strange earth air was leaking inside. She dragged herself to her feet and checked on her warriors. Most were alive, but many were injured. The ship's medical bay was damaged, and their supplies were limited. Worse yet, their main computers showed that their weapon systems were offline. They were stranded on this primitive planet with no way to call for help outside the broken hull. Zarakith could see rolling fields of green plants under a bright blue sky. The crash site was in the middle of nowhere with no signs of civilization. She had expected to land near one of Earth's major cities, where she could quickly establish control. Instead, she was stuck in some remote farming area. Jake Miller was checking the fence line on his grandmother's property when he saw the fireball streak across the morning sky. He watched it crash into the field about 2 miles away, sending up a column of black smoke. The impact shook the ground under his feet and spooked the cattle. Jake was 24 years old and had lived in Nebraska his whole life. He worked on various farms around the small town of Millbrook and helped take care of his grandmother Betty, who lived alone on her farm. He was tall and lean with brown hair and kind eyes that seemed to notice everything. His first thought was that a plane had crashed and someone might need help. Jake jumped in his old pickup truck and drove across the fields toward the smoke. He had basic first aid training from his time as a volunteer firefighter, and he knew every back road in the county. When Jake reached the crash site, he stopped his truck and stared in amazement. This was no airplane. The thing that had crashed was huge and made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light. The ship was easily 200 feet long, with strange curves and angles that hurt to look at. Directly, steam rose from the hot metal, and the air smelled of ozone and something else he could not identify. Jake approached carefully, looking for survivors. He could see a large crack in the side of the ship and decided to investigate inside. The alien vessel Jake found chaos equipment was scattered everywhere, and strange lights flickered on broken control panels. The air was thick and humid, with a metallic taste. He called out, "Hello," but got no response except for distant groaning sounds. Jake followed the sounds deeper into the ship until he found what looked like a command center. Several large figures in armor were scattered around the room, most of them unconscious. One figure near what might have been the captain's chair was moving slightly. Jake knelt beside the injured alien and carefully removed the helmet. The face underneath was clearly not human, but it was also clearly intelligent. The skin was blue-gray, and the features were sharp and angular, but there was something almost familiar about the expression of pain. The alien's eyes opened and focused on Jake with difficulty. Those large silver eyes showed surprise and confusion. The creature tried to sit up, but Jake gently pushed her back down. He could see she was badly hurt, with what looked like a head injury, and possibly broken ribs. Jake had no idea what he was dealing with, but his grandmother had raised him to help anyone who needed it. He carefully lifted the injured alien and carried her out of the crashed ship. His truck was too small, so he had to make 2 trips to get her to his grandmother's house. Betty Miller was in her kitchen making bread when Jake burst through the front door, carrying an unconscious 8-foot-tall blue alien in his arms. Betty looked up calmly from her mixing bowl, adjusted her glasses, and said, "Well, I suppose you'd better put her on the couch in the living room." Jake stared at his grandmother in amazement. Betty had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she had seen everything from car accidents to heart attacks. But Jake had expected at least some reaction to an alien visitor. Betty simply wiped her hands on her apron and went to get her medical supplies. The alien regained consciousness on Betty's old sofa, with a quilt tucked around her and an ice pack on her head. She looked around in confusion at the simple farmhouse living room with its family photos and comfortable furniture. Nothing in her warrior training had prepared her for this situation. Betty returned with her medical bag and began examining the alien's injuries with the same gentle efficiency she had used on injured farm workers and sick children for decades. She cleaned the head wound with antiseptic and checked for signs of concussion while speaking in a soft, reassuring voice. Akith tried to understand what was happening. To her, these humans should have been terrified of her. Instead, they were treating her injuries and making her comfortable. The old female seemed to have medical knowledge, while the young male had risked his own safety to rescue her from the crash. When Betty offered her a bowl of chicken soup, Zarakith was completely bewildered. In her culture, wounded enemies were either killed or left to die. The concept of showing kindness to a stranger was foreign to everything she had been taught. Her people valued only strength and conquest. Jake sat in a chair nearby, watching the alien with curious eyes rather than fear. He asked simple questions about where she came from and whether she was in pain. His voice was gentle and concerned, as if he were talking to an injured neighbor rather than a potential invaders. Evening fell. Betty made up the spare bedroom for their unexpected guest. She brought extra blankets and a glass of water and explained how the bathroom worked. Zarakith followed these simple acts of hospitality with growing confusion. This was not how conquests were supposed to work. That night, as Zarakith lay in the comfortable bed listening to the peaceful sounds of the earth, she began to question everything she thought she knew about other species. Her ship was destroyed, her crew was scattered, and she was completely at the mercy of these strange, kind humans. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt something she had never experienced before. She felt safe and cared for in a way that had nothing to do with military strength or political power. For the first time in her life, she wondered if there might be another way to live besides endless war and conquest. Zarakith woke up the next morning to the smell of bacon and coffee. She had never experienced anything like it in her life. On Vorthok, Warship's food was nutritional paste delivered through feeding tubes. The idea of preparing food for pleasure was completely alien to her warrior mindset. Betty knocked gently on the bedroom door and entered with a breakfast tray. She had prepared eggs, bacon, toast, and orange juice with the same care she had shown her own grandchildren. Zarakith tried to refuse the food because accepting charity was seen as weakness in Vorthok culture, but Betty simply smiled and said, "Nonsense, you need to eat to get your strength back." The alien commander struggled to understand these humans and their strange behavior. When she explained that she was a military officer sent to conquer their planet, Betty nodded thoughtfully and said her late husband, Charlie, had been in the army too. She asked if Zarakith missed her family back home. This question confused Zarakith more than anything else. Vorthok warriors were taken from their birth families as children and raised in military units. Family bonds were considered a distraction from duty. She had no concept of missing someone or feeling homesick, but something about Betty's gentle question made her chest feel tight in an unfamiliar way. Jake spent the morning trying to understand the alien technology from the crashed ship. He was not trying to steal it or use it as a weapon. He was simply curious about how it worked. His genuine interest in learning puzzled Zaraketh, who was used to other species either fearing her technology or trying to steal it for military advantage. While Jake worked on the ship, Betty kept Zaraketh company in the kitchen. She talked about her life in the small town and asked questions about Vorthok culture. Betty seemed genuinely interested in learning about alien society without judging it as good or bad. She listened to descriptions of warrior training and conquest with the same attention she gave to neighbors discussing their garden problems. When Zaraketh mentioned that Vorthok children were separated from their parents at age 5 to begin military training, Betty looked sad but not shocked. She said that sounded very difficult and asked if Zaraketh remembered her birth parents. The alien had to admit she had no memory of them at all. Betty began teaching Zaraketh how to cook, starting with simple tasks like mixing ingredients and measuring spices. The alien's 4 arms made her surprisingly good at multitasking in the kitchen, but she struggled with the concept of cooking as an act of love rather than mere survival. Betty explained that food prepared with care tasted better and showed people you cared about them. The first time Zaraketh successfully made scrambled eggs, Betty clapped her hands and said she was proud of her. This simple expression of approval caused something strange to happen in Zaraketh's chest. She felt warm and happy in a way that had nothing to do with conquest or military achievement. News of the crash had spread through the small town, but the official story was that it was a military aircraft, and the details were classified. Most people accepted this explanation without question. The few who had actually seen the alien ship assumed it was some kind of experimental technology. Sheriff Dan Brooks stopped by the farm on his regular rounds to check on Betty. He was a large, friendly man who had known the Miller family for decades. When he saw Zaraketh sitting at the kitchen table learning to knead bread, though, he simply nodded and said hello. He asked if she needed anything from town and whether she had proper identification papers. Betty calmly explained that their guest was an exchange student from a very remote area and was still getting used to local customs. Dan accepted this explanation without question and offered to help with any paperwork that might be needed. He mentioned that his wife, Linda, made excellent apple pie and would probably bring one over soon. This casual acceptance of a clearly non-human visitor amazed Zaraketh. In her experience, first contact between species always involved weapons and threats, but these humans seemed to take her presence in stride, as if alien visitors were perfectly normal. They were more concerned about her comfort than her potential danger. Jake returned from the crash site that evening with news that several of her crew members had regained consciousness and were trying to repair their equipment. He offered to bring them food and medical supplies. Zaraketh could not understand why he would help enemy soldiers who might attack him. When she asked Jake why he was being so kind to people who could be dangerous, he looked puzzled and said because they are hurt and far from home. He explained that helping people in need was simply the right thing to do, regardless of where they came from or what their intentions might be. Betty agreed and began preparing care packages for the injured Vorthok warriors. She packed sandwiches, cookies, and thermoses of hot soup, along with first aid supplies. Jake loaded everything into his truck and drove back to the crash site. Zaraketh watched them go with growing confusion about human nature. That afternoon, the town doctor Linda Park stopped by to check on Betty's mysterious guest. She was a young woman who had returned to Millbrook after medical school to take over the practice from the retiring town doctor. Linda examined Zaraketh's injuries with professional competence and obvious curiosity about alien physiology. Park asked intelligent questions about Vorthok biology and medicine without showing any fear or prejudice. She was fascinated by the differences between human and alien anatomy, and wondered if there were medical techniques they could learn from each other. Zarakith found herself explaining Vorthok, healing methods, and learning about human medicine. In return, when Linda mentioned that she was treating several patients with conditions that might benefit from more advanced medical technology, Zarakith offered to help. She described Vorthok healing devices that could repair injuries and cure diseases that were impossible for human medicine to treat. This offer led to Zarakith's first real contribution to the human community. She worked with Linda to modify a damaged medical scanner from her ship to help diagnose human patients. The process required both alien technology and human medical knowledge working together. Word of the miraculous new medical equipment spread quickly through the small town. People began coming to Dr. Park with problems they had suffered with for years. Zarakith found herself working as an unofficial medical technician, helping to heal humans instead of conquering them. The experience of helping sick and injured people was completely new to Zarakith. Vorthok medicine focused only on keeping warriors healthy enough to fight. The idea of healing people simply to reduce their suffering was foreign to her. But she discovered that making people feel better created the same warm feeling in her chest that she got from Betty's approval. As days passed, Zarakith began to understand that these humans had something her people lacked. They had learned to find strength in caring for each other rather than dominating others. Their society was built on cooperation and mutual support rather than conquest and submission. Betty continued to treat Zarakith like a beloved family member. She taught her to play card games and shared old photo albums full of family memories. She talked about her children and grandchildren with obvious love and pride. This concept of family loyalty extending across generations was fascinating to the alien. Commander Jake introduced Zarakith to other aspects of human culture, including music, movies, and sports. She learned to appreciate the complex emotions in human art and the way competition could be enjoyable rather than deadly. Everything about human society seemed designed to create happiness and fulfillment rather than military efficiency. One evening, while helping Betty prepare dinner, Zarakith realized that she had not thought about her military mission in several days. She had been so focused on learning human ways and helping the local community that conquest seemed like a distant and unimportant goal. This realization troubled her deeply. She had been trained since childhood to put military duty above all else. But these humans had shown her a different way of living that seemed more fulfilling than endless war. She began to wonder if the Vorthok Empire was missing something important about what life could be. When Jake asked her about her home planet and whether she missed it, Zarakith had to admit that she did not miss the constant training and fighting. She missed nothing about the harsh military life that had defined her existence, but she was beginning to understand what Betty meant when she talked about missing family. That night, Zarakith lay in bed, thinking about the choice she would eventually have to make. Her people would come looking for her, and when they did, she would have to decide whether to lead them in conquest or try to show them the peaceful way of life she had discovered for the first time in her life. She understood that there might be something more valuable than military victory. She had found something worth protecting, and it was not the Vorthok Empire, but the small human community that had welcomed her with open arms and taught her what kindness really meant. 2 weeks had passed since the crash, and Zarakith found herself settling into a routine that would have been unthinkable in her old life. She woke each morning to the sound of birds singing outside her window. Instead of military alarms, she helped Betty with household chores and discovered that there was satisfaction in simple tasks like washing dishes and tending the garden. Betty had begun teaching her more complex cooking skills, and Zarakith was amazed at how much care and attention went into preparing meals for family and friends on her homeworld. Food was fuel for warriors, but here it was an expression of love and community. Betty explained that the secret ingredient in all good cooking was caring about the people who would eat it. Jake had finally succeeded in getting one of the communication devices from the alien ship partially working. He showed Zarakith how it could interface with Earth's primitive internet, and she was fascinated by humanity's attempt to share Information globally, the idea that knowledge should be freely available to everyone was revolutionary to someone from a society where information was strictly controlled by military hierarchy. Through the internet connection, Zaraketh began learning more about human history and culture. She discovered that humans had fought many wars, but had also created amazing art, music, and literature. She read about human achievements in science and exploration, and began to understand that this species had potential far beyond what her initial scans had suggested. Linda Park visited the farm regularly now, bringing medical cases that could benefit from alien technology. Zaraketh had helped design treatments for cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, using modified Vorthok medical devices. The success of these treatments was spreading, and people were traveling from other towns to seek help. Working in the makeshift medical clinic had given Zaraketh a new perspective on the value of individual lives in Vorthok society. Warriors were replaceable units in a military machine, but each human patient was unique with their own family relationships, dreams, and contributions to their community. She began to understand why humans fought so hard to save every life. Sheriff Dan Brooks had become a regular visitor to the farm as well. He brought news from town and checked on their unusual guest with the kind of casual friendliness that still amazed Zaraketh. Dan had figured out that she was not exactly human, but he seemed more interested in whether she was happy and settled than in where she came from. The sheriff often brought his daughter Emma, who was 8 years old and completely fascinated by their alien visitor. Emma asked endless questions about space travel and life on other planets, with the innocent curiosity that only children possess. She had no fear of Zaraketh, and treated her like a favorite aunt. Teaching Emma about the stars and planets had awakened something in Zaraketh that she had not known existed. She discovered that she enjoyed sharing knowledge for its own sake, rather than for military advantage. Emma's wonder and excitement when learning new things reminded the alien commander what it felt like to be curious about the universe. Betty had started taking Zaraketh to town for shopping trips and social visits. The alien's unusual appearance caused some initial stares, but most people quickly accepted the official story about foreign exchange students. Betty's reputation in the community helped smooth over any awkward questions, and soon Zaraketh was being treated like any other newcomer. The local grocery store, the elderly clerk Mary Johnson, always asked about Zaraketh's health and whether she needed anything special. The pharmacist Robert Chen had worked with Dr. Park to ensure that human medications would be safe for alien physiology. The librarian, Susan Davis, had helped Zaraketh get a library card and recommended books about Earth history and culture. These small acts of inclusion and acceptance were more powerful than any weapon Zaraketh had ever encountered. Each friendly greeting and offer of help chipped away at her military conditioning and showed her what human civilization was really about. It was not about conquest or dominance, but about building communities where everyone could contribute and belong. Jake had taught Zaraketh to drive his pickup truck, which led to some amusing adventures as she learned to navigate Earth roads with her alien reflexes and four-armed coordination. She proved to be an excellent driver once she mastered the concept of traffic laws and courtesy. Her warrior training had given her quick reactions, but she had to learn to use them for protection rather than aggression. The weekly farmers market became one of Zaraketh's favorite activities. She helped Betty sell vegetables from their garden and learned to interact with customers who were interested in her exotic appearance but more concerned with getting fresh produce. Jake had built her a special stool so she could comfortably work at the booth, despite her unusual height. At the market, Zaraketh met other farming families and began to understand the complex web of relationships that held rural communities together. People helped each other during difficult times, shared resources, and celebrated successes together. The concept of mutual aid, without expectation of military service, was completely foreign to her background. Tom and Alice Peterson ran the neighboring farm and often stopped by to borrow tools or share news. Their teenage son Chris had been fascinated by the advanced technology in the crashed ship, and Jake had arranged for Zara to tutor him in basic physics and engineering. Chris's enthusiasm for learning reminded her of her own curiosity before military training had crushed Etha. Local church pastor, Father Michael Williams, had invited Zarakith to attend services, and while she did not understand human religious concepts, she was moved by the sense of community and shared purpose. The idea that people gathered weekly to support each other and reflect on moral questions was intriguing to someone from a culture focused only on military efficiency. Betty had begun sharing stories of her own life, including the challenges of raising 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in the Vietnam War. She talked about loss and grief, but also about finding joy in small moments and the strength that came from helping others. Zarakith began to understand that humans found meaning through connection rather than conquest. The alien commander started keeping a journal in which she recorded her observations about human behavior and her own changing thoughts. She wrote about the difference between Vorthok strength, which was based on domination, and human strength, which seemed to come from love and cooperation. The journal became a way to process ideas that would have been considered treasonous in her old life. Jake had been working with the surviving members of her crew to repair their ship, and several of them had begun visiting the farm regularly. The Vorthok warriors were initially suspicious of human kindness, but Betty's cooking and genuine concern for their welfare gradually won them over. One by one they began to question their own assumptions about conquest and warfare. Lieutenant Commander Thex had been Zarakith's most trusted officer, but even she was struggling with the contradiction between their military training and what they were experiencing on Earth. She confided to Zarakith that she had never seen their commander look so relaxed and happy. The constant stress and aggression that defined Vorthok military life had disappeared. The crew members who spent time at the farm began adopting human customs and learning to appreciate human pleasures, like hot showers, comfortable beds, and meals eaten for enjoyment rather than necessity. Several of them had begun helping with farm work and community projects, finding satisfaction in building rather than destroying. Zarakith realized that her personal transformation was spreading to her subordinates as well. They were all discovering that there were alternatives to the harsh military life they had always known. The question was whether this change could spread beyond her small crew to the larger Vorthok empires. Autumn approached. Zip found herself dreading the day when her people would come looking for her. The peaceful life she had built in this small human community felt more real and valuable than anything from her previous existence, but she knew that eventually she would have to choose between her old loyalty and her new understanding. The choice became more urgent when Jake's repairs to the communication system finally succeeded in sending a signal into space. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Vorthok fleet would detect that signal and come to investigate. What they found would determine the fate of Earth and the future of both. Zarakith looked around at the farm that had become her home and the humans who had become her family. She knew that when her people arrived, she would have to find a way to protect both sides from a war that neither really wanted. The challenge would be convincing a warrior culture that their greatest victory might come from choosing peace. 3 months after the crash, the massive Vorthok war fleet finally arrived in Earth's solar system. Their ships appeared on every telescope and radar system across the planet, causing panic among world governments. Military forces mobilized and emergency broadcasts warned civilians to prepare for possible invasions. Zarakith felt the familiar vibration in her chest that indicated nearby Vorthok ships. She had been expecting this moment, but still felt unprepared for the choice she would have to make. The peaceful life she had built seemed fragile compared to the overwhelming military power approaching Earth. Betty continued making breakfast as if nothing had changed. She hummed while cooking eggs and asked Zarakith if she wanted extra bacon. Her calm acceptance of the situation amazed the alien commander, who was used to people panicking at the first sign of military threat. Betty simply said that worry never fixed anything, and they would deal with whatever came. Jake was more concerned about the approaching fleet, but his worry focused on protecting his grandmother and the community rather than his own safety. He had spent weeks studying Vorthok technology and understood the devastating power of their weapons, but instead of feeling helpless, he began organizing the town's emergency response sheriff. Dan Brooks called a town meeting to discuss the situation most residents had figured out by now that their unusual visitor was connected to the approaching aliens. But instead of anger or fear, they showed determination to protect someone who had become part of their community. Several people volunteered to help hide Zarakith. If necessary, the response from the townspeople moved Zarakith deeply. These humans were willing to risk their lives to protect her, even though she represented everything they should fear about alien invasion. Their loyalty was based on personal relationships rather than military hierarchy, and it was stronger than any bond she had known. General Krikstar commanded the Vorthok search fleet and had been Zarakith's mentor during her early military training. He was a veteran of 30 successful conquests and had never shown mercy to any species that resisted Vorthok rule. His ship descended through Earth's atmosphere like a metal mountain blotting out the sun. The general's shuttle landed in the field where Zarakith's ship had crashed 3 months earlier. She walked out to meet him, wearing the simple human clothes that had replaced her military armor. Her crew members followed reluctantly, knowing that their commander had changed in ways that might be considered. Trisong Krikstar emerged from his shuttle in full battle armor, followed by a squad of elite warriors. He expected to find his missing commander, ready to report on her reconnaissance mission and begin the invasion. Instead, he found her looking relaxed and healthy and strange. Primitive clothing. The general demanded an explanation for her long silence and the failure to begin conquest operations. Zarakith tried to explain what she had learned about human society, but Krikstar dismissed her words as signs of mental damage from the crash. He ordered her to remember her duty and prepare for immediate invasion when Zarakith refused to give the invasion order. Krikstar became angry and confused. He had never known her to disobey direct orders or question military doctrine. The idea that she might have changed her fundamental beliefs was incomprehensible to his warrior mindset. Betty appeared at the edge of the field, carrying a tray with coffee and sandwiches. She walked calmly toward the group of armored aliens as if approaching dangerous warriors was something she did every day. Krikstar raised his weapon, but Zarakith quickly stepped between them. The elderly human woman looked up at the towering general and said he looked tired from his long journey. She offered him coffee and asked if he had eaten recently. Her complete lack of fear and genuine concern for his comfort left Krikstar speechless. Betty invited the confused general to sit at her kitchen table and proceeded to treat him with the same grandmother-like warmth she had shown Zarakith when he tried to intimidate her with threats about conquest and resistance. She simply patted his armored shoulder and said he looked too thin. Jake arrived with several other townspeople who brought more food and offered to help with anything the visitors needed. The casual friendliness of these humans bewildered the Vorthok warriors, who had expected either worship or terror. They found themselves accepting offers of hospitality from people they had come to conquer. Linda Park offered to examine any injuries the crew might have suffered during their long journey, and Sheriff Dan Brooks asked if they needed directions or assistance with anything. Several children gathered to stare at the aliens with curious excitement rather than fear. This reception was unlike anything in Vorthok military history. They had conquered civilizations that fought desperately and others that surrendered immediately, but they had never encountered a species that responded to invasion with offers of coffee and medical care. Krikstar found himself sitting in Betty's kitchen, being served homemade pie, while she asked about his family and whether he missed his home planet. Her questions awakened memories he had suppressed for decades about life before military service. He remembered having parents and siblings before being taken for warrior training. The general tried to focus on his mission, but Betty's gentle questions kept pulling him back to thoughts of what he had lost when he became a soldier. She talked about her own family and the joy she found in simple relationships. The warmth in her voice when she spoke of her grandchildren was something he had never experienced Meanwhile, Zarakith was addressing her crew and trying to explain the choice they all faced. She described what she had learned about human society and the possibility of finding meaning through cooperation rather than conquest. Her words reached beyond her immediate audience through the ship's communication system to the entire fleet. Young warriors throughout the fleet heard their respected commander describing a way of life that valued individuals and celebrated community. The idea that strength could come from protecting rather than destroying was revolutionary to people raised in military units. Lieutenant Commander Thek supported Zarakith's position and testified about the changes she had witnessed in their commander and crew. The stress and anger that defined military life had been replaced by contentment and purpose. They had found something worth building rather than conquering resistance. To Zarakith's message came from senior officers who had spent their entire lives in military service. The concept of abandoning conquest for cooperation threatened everything they believed about Vorthok's superiority. They demanded that she return to her duty and begin the invasion. The debate spread throughout the Vorthok fleet as crew members discussed what they had heard. Some were intrigued by the possibility of a different way of life, while others saw any change as betrayal of their warrior heritage. The unity that had made them effective conquerors began to fracture. Rekrikstar found himself torn between his military conditioning and the unexpected emotions that Betty's kindness had awakened. He had never questioned his role as a conqueror, but now he wondered what his life might have been like if he had been allowed to remain with his birth family. The crisis came when hardline officers attempted to remove Zarakith from command and proceed with the invasion, according to original plans. Their actions split the fleet between those who supported traditional military doctrine and those who wanted to explore the alternative she offered. Broke out between Vorthok ships as the philosophical division became a military conflict. Zarakith realized that her attempt to prevent one war had started another. The species she had hoped to save from conquest was now caught between opposing Vorthok factions. Betty continued to serve food and offer comfort to confused warriors, while explosions lit up the sky above her farm. She seemed to understand that the battle was really about choosing between fear and love, even though it was being fought with advanced weapons. Zarakith made her final choice when she saw that both sides were preparing for a battle that would devastate Earth regardless of who won. She activated her ship's communication system and broadcast a message that reached not just the warring fleets but the entire Vorthok Empire. Her words described the peaceful community that had welcomed her and the humans who had shown her what civilization could be. She challenged every Vorthok to consider whether their greatest victory might come from learning to build rather than destroy. The message sparked debates across the Empire as ordinary Vorthok citizens heard about alternatives to endless military service. For the first time in generations, they began to question whether conquest was really the only path to strength and meaning. The fate of two species now hung in the balance as ancient beliefs clashed with new possibilities. The choice between war and peace would determine not just the future of Earth, but the direction of Vorthok civilization itself. The battle in Earth's skies lasted only 6 hours, but its effects would reshape two civilizations. Zarakith's message had reached across the galaxy, awakening questions that had been suppressed for generations. Ordinary Vorthok citizens began demanding answers about why their children were taken from military service and whether endless conquest was really necessary on the Vorthok homeworld. Millions of families who had lost children to military conscription suddenly understood that there might be alternatives. Workers who spent their lives producing weapons and warships began imagining what they could build if their society focused on creation rather than destruction. The fighting ended when younger officers throughout the fleet began refusing orders to continue the battle. They had heard Zarakith's description of life without constant warfare and decided they wanted to experience it for themselves. Ship after ship declared support for peaceful contact with Earth. Krikstar found himself leading a faction that wanted to return to traditional military values, but his support was crumbling as more warriors chose to follow Zarakith's example. The general sat in Betty's kitchen watching human families go about their daily lives while explosions faded in the sky. Above, Betty offered him another cup of coffee and asked if he had children of his own. Back home, the question hit him like a physical blow, because he remembered now that he had once been a father before military. Promotion required him to give up personal relationships. The pain of that loss had been buried for decades. When Crickstar began to cry, Betty simply handed him tissues and said that grief was natural when people were separated from their families. She explained that humans believed family bonds made them stronger rather than weaker, and that love was the foundation of their civilization. The general's emotional breakdown was broadcast throughout the Vorthok fleet as his communication channel remained open. His tears and Betty's gentle comfort showed thousands of warriors what they had been denied by their military system. The scene was more powerful than any weapon in changing hearts and minds. Within days, the Vorthok Civil War was over. As ship after ship declared for peace and cooperation, the old military hierarchy collapsed, as warriors chose to follow commanders who offered hope for a different kind of life. The empire that had conquered 17 worlds began transforming itself from within. Earth's governments were amazed to receive formal requests for diplomatic contact rather than demands for surrender. Vorthok representatives asked permission to establish peaceful colonies and offered to share advanced technology. In exchange for learning about human social systems, Erix became the first Vorthok ambassador to Earth, with her headquarters remaining at Betty's farm in Nebraska. The small farmhouse became the center of interplanetary diplomacy as beings from across the galaxy came to learn about the human community that had sparked this transformation. Jake found himself appointed as Earth's first alien technology coordinator, working with former Vorthok engineers to develop solutions for climate change, disease, and energy production. His curiosity and willingness to learn made him an ideal bridge between human and alien knowledge. Dr. Linda Park established the first interspecies medical research center, studying how Vorthok and human biology could inform treatments for both species. Her work led to cures for diseases that had plagued both civilizations and established a model for scientific cooperation. Betty became something of a galactic celebrity, known throughout several star systems as the human grandmother who had ended a war with kindness and chocolate chip cookies. She received visitors from dozens of worlds, but continued to treat everyone with the same warmth she showed her neighbors. The small town of Millbrook was transformed as beings from across the galaxy came to study the community that had changed the course of history. The local economy boomed as interstellar visitors came to experience authentic human hospitality and learn about cooperation. Sheriff Dan Brooks found himself dealing with parking problems caused by alien spacecraft and noise complaints about late-night diplomatic negotiations. But he handled these challenges with the same calm competence he brought to every other aspect of law enforcement. Many Vorthok warriors chose to remain on Earth, integrating into human communities and learning to find purpose through building rather than conquering. They brought advanced technology and received education in human values like compassion, cooperation, and family relationships. Former General Crickstar established a rehabilitation center for ex-military Vorthok who struggled to adapt to peaceful life. He worked with human counselors to help warriors deal with trauma and discover new sources of meaning and identity. Beyond military service, the Vorthok Empire restructured itself as a commonwealth of worlds focused on exploration and mutual aid rather than conquest. Former military resources were redirected toward scientific research, infrastructure development, and cultural exchange programs. Earth joined this new commonwealth as an equal partner, contributing human expertise in social organization, community building, and conflict resolution. In exchange, humans gained access to advanced technology and the vast knowledge of other civilizations. Children on both worlds grew up learning about cooperation between species and the possibility of solving conflicts through understanding rather than force. The generation born after first contact would build relationships that ensured peace between their civilization. Check often reflected on the chain of events that had brought her To this new life, a mission of conquest had become a journey of discovery that changed not just her own perspective, but the destiny of two species. The crash that had seemed like failure had been the beginning of success beyond anything she could have imagined. She continued to live with Betty and Jake, finding family relationships that were deeper and more meaningful than anything in her military background. The alien commander, who had once valued only strength and conquest, discovered that her greatest achievement was learning to love and be loved. Betty still made cookies every week, but now she had help from beings across the galaxy who came to learn her recipes. Each batch represented the simple truth that had transformed to civilization's caring for others was more powerful than any weapon. Jake married Dr. Linda Park in a ceremony attended by representatives from 12 different worlds. Their wedding became a symbol of the cooperation and friendship that had grown from that first moment when a young farmer chose to help an injured stranger. The crashed Vorthok ship remained in the field where it had fallen, but now it served as a monument to the power of choosing compassion over conquest. Visitors from across the galaxy came to see the place where peace had begun with a simple act of kindness. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the Vorthok Empire, they would trace it back to a single moment when an elderly human woman offered coffee to a confused alien general. The lesson was clear: change could begin with the smallest acts of love and grow to reshape entire civilization. Check kept her journal and continued recording observations about human nature and the ongoing evolution of interspecies relations. Her writings became required reading for diplomats and social scientists throughout the Commonwealth, showing how understanding between different peoples was always possible. The galaxy had learned that the strongest foundation for any civilization was not military might or technological superiority, but the simple human values of kindness, cooperation, and love. These qualities had the power to transform enemies into friends and turn conquest into collaboration. In the end, the invasion of Earth had succeeded, but not in the way anyone had expected. Humanity had conquered their would-be conquerors through the irresistible force of compassion and the overwhelming power of treating strangers as family.